Story 1. The Silent Call. It was a quiet Friday evening, and Emily was working the night shift at a small call center. The office was located in a rundown building, the kind of place where the paint was peeling off the walls, and the floors creaked with every step. Emily didn't mind working alone. She often found solace in the silence, allowing her to focus on answering calls without any distractions. But that night, the silence seemed heavier, oppressive almost. Her shift started at 10 p.m., and by midnight the phone lines had grown eerily still. She stared at the flickering monitor, waiting for the next call to come in. Usually they would receive a steady stream of calls, even during late hours, but tonight it felt as though the world had forgotten this small call center existed. Around 12:30 a.m., the phone finally rang. Emily answered with her usual script. "Thank you for calling. How can I assist you?" But there was no reply, just dead air. "Hello?" she repeated, but still no one responded. All she could hear was faint breathing on the other end of the line. It wasn't the first time someone had called and not said anything, so she wasn't too concerned. She hung up and returned to her work. A few minutes later, the phone rang again. She answered, but once again there was silence followed by soft, shallow breaths. Emily felt a chill crawl up her spine. "Who is this?" she demanded, her voice sharper now. But there was no answer, only the breathing. She slammed the phone down, her heart pounding in her chest. The phone rang again, immediately. Emily hesitated, her hand hovering over the receiver. When she finally picked up, there was no breathing this time. Just a low, eerie hum, like a faint chant in a language she didn't recognize. The sound was distant, echoing as if coming from a dark, hollow place. She hung up without saying a word, her hands trembling. Trying to calm herself, she stepped out of the small office into the corridor, dimly lit by flickering fluorescent lights. She needed to catch her breath, clear her mind. As she stood there, the phone rang again. This time, though, it wasn't the call center phone, it was her cell phone. Pulling it from her pocket, she glanced at the screen. The number was blocked. Nervously, she answered, "Hello?" There was a pause, then a voice whispered, "I see you." Emily's blood ran cold. She looked around, her eyes scanning the empty corridor. "Who is this? What do you want?" she yelled, her voice cracking. The line went dead. She tried to tell herself it was just a prank, but something about the voice, the heavy breathing, and the strange hum felt too real. She rushed back to her desk, planning to call security. But when she got there, she saw something that made her freeze. Her monitor, which had been displaying routine call information, now showed a live video feed of the hallway outside the office. In the grainy footage, Emily saw herself standing in the corridor just moments ago, looking around in fear. But that wasn't what terrified her. What terrified her was the shadowy figure that stood just behind her, barely visible in the flickering light. Story 2. The Warehouse Haunting. Jacob worked as a night security guard at a large, empty warehouse on the outskirts of town. His job was simple: patrol the warehouse, check the surveillance cameras, and ensure everything was locked up tight. The warehouse was massive, filled with towering shelves of forgotten inventory that hadn't been touched in years. The dim lighting and the echoing sounds of his footsteps often made the place feel eerie, but Jacob was used to it. He had been working there for months and hadn't experienced anything unusual, until one particular night. It was a stormy evening, with thunder rumbling in the distance and rain pelting the windows. Jacob was on his usual rounds when something caught his attention on the security cameras. One of the motion detectors in the farthest aisle of the warehouse had gone off, signaling movement. This wasn't entirely unusual. Sometimes a rat or a stray cat would trigger the sensors, so he didn't think much of it. Still, he had to check it out. Grabbing his flashlight, Jacob made his way to the back of the warehouse. The rain against the metal roof was deafening, and the wind howled through the cracks in the walls, adding to the atmosphere of unease. As he approached the aisle in question, his flashlight beam flickered for a moment before settling. The aisle was long and narrow, with shelves towering on either side, casting deep shadows in the dim light. Jacob scanned the area but didn't see anything out of the ordinary. He was about to turn back when he heard it, a soft, almost imperceptible sound, like someone whispering his name. He froze, listening intently. The whisper came again, clearer this time. "Jacob!" His heart raced. He swung the flashlight around, expecting to see someone standing there, but the aisle was empty. "Hello?" he called out, his voice shaky. No response, just the constant hum of the warehouse's machinery. Telling himself it was just the wind, Jacob turned to leave. But as he did, something caught his eye. One of the boxes on the shelf was moving. It wasn't just a small shift. It was shaking violently as if something, or someone, was trapped inside. Jacob backed away slowly, his flashlight trembling in his hand. The box continued to shake, harder and harder, until it suddenly stopped. Then, without warning, the box flew off the shelf, crashing to the ground with a deafening thud. Jacob ran. He didn't stop until he was back in the security office, panting and drenched in sweat. He locked the door and sat in front of the security monitors, his eyes glued to the screen. He rewound the footage from the last few minutes, expecting to see the box fall on its own, maybe due to a loose shelf or a draft. But what he saw made his blood run cold. In the footage, just before the box flew off the shelf, a shadowy figure appeared behind him. It was tall, with long, distorted limbs and no face. The figure reached out toward Jacob, and the box flew off the shelf as if it had been pushed. Jacob never worked another night shift at the warehouse. Story 3. The hospital's ghost patient. Samantha was a nurse working the night shift at a small hospital in a quiet rural town. She loved her job, but the night shifts could be grueling. The halls were often empty, save for the occasional patient in the emergency room or the long-term care unit. But the hospital had a reputation. There were stories, whispered among the staff, about a particular room on the 3rd floor that was supposedly haunted. Room 307 had been closed for years. The official reason was that it was no longer needed, but the nurses who had worked there long enough knew the real story. Decades ago, a patient had died in that room under strange circumstances. Ever since, people reported strange occurrences, cold spots, flickering lights, and the sound of someone walking up and down the hallway outside the room in the dead of night. Samantha had never experienced anything out of the ordinary in the hospital, but one night, while doing her rounds, she passed by room 307. As she walked by, she heard it, soft footsteps shuffling behind the door. Her heart skipped a beat. No one was supposed to be in there. She stood outside the door, listening. The footsteps grew louder, then stopped. Slowly, she reached for the door handle, her hand trembling. She knew the room was locked, but as she touched the handle, it turned easily in her grip. The door creaked open, revealing the dark, empty room. Samantha hesitated before stepping inside. The air was freezing, much colder than the rest of the hospital. She turned on the light, but the bulb flickered, casting strange, dancing shadows across the room. There was nothing unusual at first glance, but then she saw it, an indentation on the bed, as if someone had been lying there moments ago. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind her, trapping her inside. She spun around, her heart racing, and saw the faint outline of a figure standing in the corner of the room. It was a man, pale and gaunt, his hospital gown tattered and stained. His hollow eyes stared at her, unblinking. Samantha screamed, but the sound barely escaped her throat. The figure slowly raised a hand, pointing directly at her, and whispered, "Help me!" Samantha fled the room, never looking back. When she returned with another nurse, the room was empty, the bed perfectly made, and the door locked tight once again. No one believed her, but Samantha knew what she had seen. Room 307 wasn't empty. The ghost of the patient was still there, waiting for someone to help him escape whatever nightmare he was trapped in.